know what Legos, IKEA, and cake mix have in common? They have all, interestingly, been materials used in experiments that explore the question, what makes us feel good about our work? On this Labor Day weekend, after a summer that hopefully included some rest, and as we gear up for the busyness of this fall season, it seems an appropriate time to ask ourselves, what makes us feel good about our work? And where can we find meaning in it? For some of us, we are lucky enough to have work that is an expression of our call, our passion, and our joy. For others, it's more about the money. And sometimes our work is really hard, taking us away from things that we would rather be doing. So what makes us feel good about it, and how can it all be life-giving? Dan Ariely, a professor of psychology and behavioral economics, led a study entitled Man's Search for Meaning, the Case of Legos, in which he asked participants in the study to build characters from the Legos Bionicles series. He told the participants to build the same thing over and over. One group's Lego creations were kept until they were all finished with the experiment, at which point they would be disassembled, while the other group's creations were disassembled as soon as they were built. I know. Participants in the second group, they would build one Bionicle, and then a second, at which point the first would be destroyed, and then they would go on to build a third, at which the second one was destroyed, and so on. It reminded me a little bit of playing with Legos or blocks with my little brother as a kid. So while the first group saw the fruits of their labor, the second was given a task that felt futile. The first group made 11 Bionicles on average, while the second group made only 7 before they gave up and quit. Even the small reward of seeing one's Lego creations accumulate brought meaning to the participants' work. So what about IKEA and cake mix? Well, assembling furniture from IKEA, if you've ever done puzzle, you follow assembly instructions with no words, while sorting through little wooden pegs and screws of various sizes. It's a challenge, to say the least, one that can cause you to start throwing little wooden pegs across the room in frustration. But once it's assembled, you're very proud of it. Look what I accomplished. I finished this thing. It took some struggle, but I made it. And there's a similar effect with cake mix. Cake mix was extremely unpopular when first introduced onto the market because there was not enough effort involved. It was so easy that no one could serve a cake to their guests and say, look at this cake that I made for you. So in response, the cake mix companies took the eggs and the milk out of the powder. And voila, now cake mixes fill half an aisle at the grocery store. The simple act of adding eggs and milk or oil to a powdered mix makes people feel like it is more of their creation. This is another lesson of Ariely's research. The harder we work on something, often the happier and more proud we are of the result. A third lesson of Ariely's research is that it matters whether our work is noticed and appreciated. He gave students a piece of paper with a word exercise on it, and they were offered a monetary reward when they turned it in. The first group wrote their names on the sheet of paper and handed it in to the experimenter, who looked it over and said, before putting it in a pile. The second group didn't write their names on the paper, but they turned in their sheet, and the experimenter just tossed it on a pile without looking at it. A third group had their work shredded immediately upon turning it in. He found that the people whose work was ignored or shredded needed a much larger monetary incentive to continue with the experiment. Like I told the children before they left for their classes, it's important to know that our work the effort that we put into things, and the creations that we produce matter, and that they're acknowledged and appreciated by others. Another answer to Ariely's question, what makes us feel good about our work, is when it helps others or serves a larger good. At the service fair that we had at the church here this past March, we invited you to share on little sheets of paper in your order of service how you were helping and serving in your community. Many of you wrote about your job as one of the ways that you serve your community. I had a conversation recently with a member of this church who talked about their career in real estate as a form of service. They work with people to help them find a home that they can be proud of and comfortable in, and they guide people through what can be a very overwhelming process with care and encouragement. I'm aware that we in this room do many different kinds of work. Some are in what are called the helping professions. Some are in business and finance, arts and culture, the service industry, and others do the unpaid work of parenting. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said in a speech once that all labor has dignity. And as such, all workers should be treated with respect and dignity. Now here in our own city and state, this year, construction workers are fighting for the right to take rest and water breaks during long, hot shifts. Our church and Dallas Area Interfaith, of which we're a part, has been advocating with our city councilors to require employers to extend this basic human right for health and for the health and well-being of their employees. It's struggles like this one that we are called on to remember every year on Labor Day. We can also look back at Dr. King's 1968 speech to more than 1,000 sanitation workers in Memphis who had walked off the job. In his speech, he said, "So often we overlook the work and the significance of those who are not in professional jobs, of those who are not in the so-called big jobs. But let me say to you tonight that whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity and is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and it has worth." The reading that you heard earlier by Ruth Foreman, her work as worship, points toward the root of the word worship that we use all the time. It translates as shaping worth. Her work always sustenance for someone and an offering. May her soul be fed, writes Foreman. When we can approach our work in this way, as shaping something of worth or as service to humanity, it carries so much greater meaning. One problem with the culture that we live in, however, is that it promotes overwork. Economist Juliet Schor, author of the book The Overworked American, writes that the amount of time per year an average employed person spent on the job went up 163 hours in the latter half of the 20th century. That's an equivalent of an extra month of work per year. The reason for this, she says, is the work ethic that operates in our country, which tells many of us that our worth as human beings is dependent on our work and our accomplishments. In other words, we are what we do. I know I've certainly been influenced by this culture of overwork. Perhaps you have too. I have a strong work ethic, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But there have been times in my life where I hit a point that I knew I had taken on too much. I had to press the reset button and remind myself of what is most important and discern the work that I needed to do and the work that I needed to let go. And if I'm really honest with myself, the reason I took on so much work is because, one, it felt good to accomplish things, to be asked or invited to do something, and to be wanted and needed. But there's a difference between knowing that what you do matters and allowing your work to fuel your self-worth. The overworked American that Schor talks about is the person who allows work to shape their own worth rather than using their work to shape something of worth. I hope that you hear the distinction in those two. Does the overworked American sound like anyone you know? Maybe. If it does, I invite you to do what others did for me, which is to say stop or reset. I know that in my life, church reminds me of what is most important and helps me with this discernment. And I hope that that is true for you too. Now, religion can promote a healthy work life, but historically it has also promoted the opposite. The self-worth-based work ethic is not an invention of the 20th century. In fact, it has deep religious roots going back to the Protestant Reformation. Our earliest Protestant forebears followed the French theologian John Calvin, who promoted a doctrine of predestination. The fate of all souls has been predetermined by God, he said, and there is nothing we can do to alter it. So, as a way of dealing with this theology, people started believing that God favored the elect, and that one's good favor or bad experiences in this life were a sign of whether one was predestined for heaven or predestined for hell. Of course, Calvinists all wanted to be among the elect, and so they worked very hard, touting their successes and accomplishments as evidence of God's good favor. They were constantly trying to prove through hard work that they deserved to live. It's amazing how this ethic permeates the culture we live in even today. And yet, as Unitarian Universalists, our theology does not support this. Going back to the time of Calvin, there were others, including early Unitarians, who countered Calvin's message. One of them, Michael Servetus, was a Spanish theologian and physician who corresponded frequently with Calvin. There are many letters going back and forth debating theological doctrines such as the Trinity, predestination, and infant baptism. Unfortunately, Servetus's views so angered Calvin and his followers and those who were in power that he was imprisoned for heresy and burned at the stake with his own books as kindling. Unitarians and Universalists have been countercultural for a long time. When it comes to how our culture today views work, again, we are called to act differently. Our Universalist tradition teaches us that God is too loving to send some of us to hell, while others, the elect, go to heaven. And no matter how lazy or hardworking we are in this life, no matter what kind of work we do, God's love prevails. Our actions shape our quality of life now, but not beyond this life. Our faith calls us, I believe, to counter the work ethic that says our work shapes our worth, and that demands of us proof that our life is worthwhile. Because we know that we are all worthy of love, and each of us and our work has dignity. As Reverend White said a couple weeks ago in a sermon, one of the gifts of our Unitarian Universalist tradition is knowing that you are loved and that you have a lot of work to do. But that this love is not contingent on that work. What our faith calls us to is work that builds humanity now, in this lifetime and on this earth, not to justify our existence or our fate, but rather to create a more just and loving world, and to shape something of worth that improves our lives and the lives of others. So what work is deserving of your life? That's a question that I want to put to you this morning. What work is deserving of your life, and what is the work in which you find meaning, and in which you contribute to something larger? This is what is called vocation. The theologian Frederick Buechner wrote that vocation is the place where our deep gladness meets the world's deep need. Or for the woodcarver, in our reading this morning, it's where his own collected thought encounters the hidden potential of the wood. And from it, from this live encounter, comes the work that the people had ascribed to the spirits. Through what sounds like a meditation practice and a spiritual practice of fasting, the woodcarver was able to clear away all of the thought and worry about the king, about gain and success, about reward and criticism, things that so often motivate work. And when he focused on seeing the potential in the wood that he could bring out, he created something beautiful. Often vocation is talked about in the context of trying to find one's career or make a career change to a kind of work that is more true to oneself. But discerning vocation does not necessarily require a major career transition. It may be simply, or not so simply, a shift of mind and heart to see more deeply the meaning of one's work. Dan Ariely's research demonstrated the importance of having what we do noticed and appreciated. It's important for us to acknowledge that our own work matters and not to rely solely on the approval of others. So my hope for you on this Labor Day weekend is that you will be able to celebrate your work and the ways in which it serves humanity and contributes to a more loving and beautiful world. And take from today the lesson that our ancestors taught in a culture dominated by Calvinism. May your work be an expression of who you are and not the other way around. Find what feeds your soul in your work and do more of it. Know that you are worthy, and find a way to help work toward a day when every worker is treated as if they are a human being with inherent worth and dignity. Through this and through the fruits of your labor, may you be a force for shaping what is of worth in our world. May it be so.